Look at Pennsylvania from above on any clear night, and you will see something that does not make immediate sense. Something that challenges what you think you know about how American cities and regions develop over time. The eastern half of the state radiates light in every direction, with Philadelphia anchoring a sprawling metropolitan constellation that bleeds into the suburbs and stretches its luminous tendrils toward New York City to the north and Baltimore to the south, creating an almost unbroken corridor of human activity and economic vitality. The western half tells a completely different story, one written in darkness and empty spaces punctuated only by the solitary glow of Pittsburgh, which sits in the Appalachian landscape like a lone campfire in an otherwise abandoned wilderness. Most people who notice this stark division assume they understand it immediately, pointing to the Appalachian Mountains that run through Pennsylvania's midsection like a geological spine and declaring that mountains have always been barriers to human settlement, natural walls that keep populations confined to more accessible terrain. This explanation feels intuitive and satisfies our desire for simple geographic determinism, but it misses the most fascinating part of the story entirely, because Pittsburgh was not always surrounded by darkness and emptiness. In the 1940s, this single city was responsible for producing 20% of all the steel manufactured anywhere on planet Earth. Not 20% of American steel, but 1/5 of the entire global supply, which meant that industrial smoke pouring from its furnaces was so thick and so constant that streetlights had to remain illuminated at noon because the sun could not penetrate the haze that hung over the city. The Homestead Works alone, just one facility among dozens scattered across the region, employed 15,000 workers who poured molten metal and shaped the raw materials that would become skyscrapers in Manhattan, bridges across the Mississippi River, and railroad tracks stretching from coast to coast. Western Pennsylvania during its industrial peak was not empty or irrelevant. It was indispensable to the American economy and to the broader project of industrialization that defined the 20th century. So the question that should interest us is not why Western Pennsylvania failed to develop in the first place, because that frame assumes a region that never succeeded, never mattered, never drew millions of people to its valleys and hilltops. The real question, the one that actually explains the darkness visible from space today, is why a region that once dominated global industry and attracted workers from around the world has become one of the most sparsely populated areas in the eastern United States. To understand what happened to Western Pennsylvania, you have to begin with what happened to Eastern Pennsylvania, because the story of these two regions is really a story about timing, about the compounding advantages that come from getting started first and the nearly insurmountable obstacles faced by those who arrive late to a game where the rules have already been written by others. Philadelphia was founded in 1682 at the precise point where two rivers converge and provide direct maritime access to the Atlantic Ocean, which meant that from its very first days as a colonial settlement, it possessed everything a port city needed to thrive in an age when water transportation was the only efficient way to move goods and people across long distances. Ships could sail directly from the Delaware River to Caribbean sugar plantations, to London's commercial docks, to any port in the Atlantic world that mattered for trade and commerce. By the 1770s, less than a century after its founding, Philadelphia had grown into the third most important business center in the entire British Empire, with a population of 30,000 people supported by Caribbean trade routes, shipbuilding industries, and an elaborate network of merchants who controlled the flow of goods across the American colonies. Meanwhile, during this same period, Western Pennsylvania did not have a single permanent British settlement until 1759, and even that first settlement was really just a military fortification rather than a true civilian community. The French had controlled Fort Duquesne at the strategic confluence of rivers that would eventually become Pittsburgh, and British forces did not capture this position and rename it Fort Pitt until 1758, at which point the entire surrounding region remained pure wilderness without roads or towns or farms or any of the infrastructure that makes sustained human settlement possible. That represents an 80-year head start for the eastern part of the state. And in early American history, a head start of that magnitude was not simply an advantage that could be overcome with sufficient effort, it was a compounding engine that grew more powerful with each passing year. Capital accumulated in Philadelphia attracted more capital from investors who wanted exposure to proven markets. Infrastructure built to serve early settlers attracted new waves of settlers who wanted access to established trade networks, and commercial networks that connected Philadelphia merchants to Atlantic markets attracted even more trade as the city's reputation spread across the British Empire. Every year that Philadelphia grew and prospered, it pulled further ahead of any potential competitors. Every year that Western Pennsylvania remained unsettled wilderness, the gap between East and West widened into something that would shape the state's development for centuries. Consider what this timing gap meant in concrete, practical terms that affected real people making real decisions about where to invest their money and build their lives. By the time Pittsburgh had constructed its first permanent buildings, Philadelphia had already produced Benjamin Franklin, hosted the Continental Congress where American independence was debated and declared, and served as the capital of the United States during the critical early years when the new nation's institutions were being designed. By the time Western Pennsylvania had established its first banks, Eastern Pennsylvania had accumulated generations of wealth held by families whose commercial success stretched back to the colonial era, along with established trade relationships connecting Philadelphia merchants to every major Atlantic port. By the time Pittsburgh finally developed into a genuine city with urban amenities, Eastern Pennsylvania had already built universities that trained professionals, hospitals that provided advanced medical care, insurance companies that spread financial risk, and dense networks of commercial connections linking Philadelphia to every major market along the Atlantic seaboard from Boston to Charleston. The West had mountains and rivers and ambitious people who believed they could build something significant in the Appalachian wilderness. But ambition alone does not create cities or sustain large populations, because you need the infrastructure that can only come with time and accumulated investment. The Appalachian Mountains were not merely inconvenient obstacles that added a few extra days to a journey. They were a genuine fortress that seemed designed by geology itself to separate eastern and western Pennsylvania into different worlds. The Allegheny Front rises more than 2,000 feet above the surrounding landscape in some locations, creating a wall of steep terrain covered in dense forest that had to be crossed using crude paths that hugged narrow valleys and required military escorts to protect travelers. A journey from Philadelphia to the location that would become Pittsburgh could require weeks of exhausting, dangerous travel through terrain where a broken wagon wheel or a sudden storm could mean death. And for most of Pennsylvania's early history, the western third of the state existed in a state of practical isolation from the centers of commerce and political power concentrated in the east. Americans, however, have never been particularly interested in accepting geographic destiny as an unchangeable fact. And if the mountains stood in the way of westward expansion, they would find ways to move through them or around them regardless of the engineering challenges involved. In 1834, engineers completed one of the most audacious transportation projects of the entire 19th century, a system called the Allegheny Portage Railroad that was unlike any other railroad built before or since. This was not a conventional railroad where trains simply rolled along level tracks, but rather an elaborate system of inclined planes that literally hauled canal boats loaded with cargo over the mountains using a combination of water, rails, and mechanical ingenuity. Boats would float along a canal until they reached the base of the mountains, at which point they would be lifted entirely out of the water onto specialized railroad cars, dragged up one side of the mountain using stationary engines and cables, transported across the summit, and then lowered down the opposite side before being returned to the water to continue their journey. The system was slow and expensive and mechanically complicated, but it worked well enough to dramatically reduce travel times between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. 20 years later, the Pennsylvania Railroad completed in 1854 a continuous rail line connecting Philadelphia directly to Pittsburgh, including the Gallitzin Tunnel, which extended 3,600 feet straight through solid rock in an era when drilling and blasting tunnels of that length required enormous amounts of manual labor. The journey that had once consumed weeks could now be completed in a single day, which meant that the mountains that had seemed like an impenetrable barrier for over a century had finally been conquered, and what came next would transform western Pennsylvania from an isolated afterthought into a genuine world power. Andrew Carnegie established the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in 1875 just outside Pittsburgh, and within a single generation, the region surrounding this initial facility had become the beating heart of American industrial production. By the 1940s, Pittsburgh's mills operated 24-hour shifts in conditions of blistering heat where furnaces glowed so intensely that workers' faces would burn from the radiant energy, and the city produced so much steel so constantly that 20% of the entire world's supply originated from this single region. Industrial smoke hung so thick over the entire metropolitan area that streetlights remained illuminated at noon because natural sunlight could not penetrate the haze. Rivers ran orange with industrial runoff, and the air itself tasted like metal, creating an environment that was simultaneously proof of human productive capacity and evidence of the environmental costs that industrial societies were willing to accept. The Homestead Works alone employed 15,000 people at its peak, and entire neighborhoods were constructed around individual mills to house the workers and their families, creating densely packed working-class communities with names like Braddock, Duquesne, and McKeesport, where generation after generation followed each other into the same plants, doing the same dangerous work, building lives and identities around the rhythms of industrial production. Western Pennsylvania had not merely caught up to the eastern part of the state after its 80-year delay, it had actually surpassed the East in terms of raw industrial output and global economic significance, because Pittsburgh was producing the steel that became skyscrapers in every major American city, bridges spanning every major American river, and railroad tracks connecting every region of an expanding continental nation. The region was not just successful, it was absolutely essential to the entire project of American economic development, which meant that Western Pennsylvania's population grew rapidly as workers migrated from across the United States and from Europe to take jobs in the mills that seemed to offer stable employment for anyone willing to endure the heat and danger. But all of this accumulated power and all of this concentrated population growth rested on a single foundation that seemed solid but was actually far more fragile than anyone realized, and foundations that appear unshakable can develop cracks that eventually bring down everything built upon them. Steel production required something very specific to remain profitable, which was a global economy that needed exactly the type and quantity of steel that Pittsburgh manufactured at the price point that Pittsburgh's cost structure required. And as long as that precise equation remained balanced, the region prospered and populations continued growing. But the region had constructed its entire economy without any backup plan, without meaningful economic diversification, without any hedge against the inevitable moment when global conditions would change. When you examined Western Pennsylvania's economic base during its industrial peak, you saw steel production, coal mining to fuel the steel mills, and various supporting industries that provided inputs to the steel and coal sectors, and that was essentially the complete picture. Eastern Pennsylvania, by complete contrast, had never been a monoculture economy dependent on a single industry. Philadelphia maintained ports that connected it to global shipping networks, railroads that linked it to New York and Washington, financial institutions that provided capital for ventures across multiple sectors, manufacturing operations producing diverse goods, educational institutions training professionals, and service industries supporting a complex urban economy. The Lehigh Valley had produced textiles and cement during its industrial era, and when those industries declined, the region reinvented itself as a logistics hub, taking advantage of its location along transportation corridors. When one economic sector struggled in eastern Pennsylvania, other sectors absorbed displaced workers and maintained overall employment levels, preventing the kind of catastrophic collapse that occurs when a single dominant industry fails. The East had constructed an economy with redundancy built into its structure, not through careful planning, but through the accident of history and geographic location that had allowed multiple industries to develop simultaneously over centuries. Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania had made a different choice, putting everything on steel production because steel was what the world economy demanded in enormous quantities, and that choice seemed perfectly rational. But they had placed all their economic bets on a single number, and the wheel was about to stop spinning in their favor. The trigger came on October 6, 1977, when U.S. Steel announced 4,500 layoffs in a single day, telling workers who had spent their entire adult lives in the mills, men whose fathers and grandfathers had worked the same furnaces, that they should not return to work. Then came 1,800 more layoffs in November 1979, as the company continued shedding workers in response to declining demand and increased competition. Then came the worst news in 1980, when U.S. Steel posted a $239 million quarterly loss, the largest in American corporate history at that point, signaling that the crisis was not a temporary downturn, but rather a fundamental structural transformation. The collapse accelerated rapidly, with between 1981 and 1983 seeing 150,000 steelworkers losing their jobs across the entire region, which meant that the social fabric holding together entire communities was being torn apart as unemployment rates climbed past 17%. Towns that had been built around single mills suddenly found themselves with nothing. No alternative employers to absorb displaced workers, no other industries capable of providing comparable wages, no coherent plan for what comes next when the defining feature of your community's identity simply vanishes. Braddock, which had been home to 20,000 people during the height of steel production, began emptying out as families who had lived there for generations packed their belongings and moved to other regions in search of work, leaving behind homes that would never find buyers in a collapsed real estate market. McKeesport lost half its population over the following decades, with each departing family making the rational individual decision that created collective catastrophe for the community left behind. Property values collapsed so quickly that some homeowners simply walked away from their houses, abandoning mortgages and leaving behind physical structures that would stand empty for years because there were no buyers willing to take them. Schools that had served multiple generations closed their doors permanently due to lack of students. Churches that had anchored neighborhood social life locked their doors as congregations dwindled. Bars where men had gathered after shifts went dark, and main streets that had bustled with commerce became rows of shuttered storefronts with broken windows and fading signs advertising businesses that no longer existed. The psychological damage inflicted by this collapse was at least as severe as the economic damage, because these were communities where masculine identity and personal self-worth had been intimately tied to industrial work and the role of provider that steel jobs had made possible. You were a steel worker, your father had been a steel worker, your grandfather had been a steel worker, and everyone assumed your sons would be steel workers as well, maintaining an unbroken chain that connected generations. When the mills closed permanently, people did not just lose jobs and paychecks, they lost the entire future they had been promised and had organized their lives around. They lost the identity that had given meaning to years of difficult work, and they lost the sense that their sacrifices had been in service of something larger. The Homestead Works shut down permanently in 1986, which meant that the furnaces that had glowed day and night for generations went cold and silent, and the massive buildings that had housed the machinery of production stood empty as weather and vandalism took their toll. Today, the site where the Homestead Works once stood has been transformed into a shopping center called the Waterfront, where visitors can eat at chain restaurants and shop at big box stores on the exact same ground where workers once poured molten steel. A few smokestacks have been preserved as monuments, architectural remnants that stand isolated among parking lots, but most people walking past these preserved structures have no idea what they represent or what happened on this ground. The empire of steel had lasted approximately 1 century from its initial rise to its final collapse, and when it fell apart, it took an entire regional economy and population base down with it, creating the demographic void that is visible from space when you look at Pennsylvania at night. What makes the Pennsylvania story particularly instructive is that while Western Pennsylvania was experiencing this collapse, Eastern Pennsylvania was simultaneously building something different and more resilient, not dramatically or spectacularly, but steadily and incrementally, sector by sector and decade by decade, constructing a diversified economic base that could withstand shocks that would have devastated a concentrated industrial economy. The Philadelphia suburbs attracted logistics and warehousing operations from companies that wanted proximity to Interstate 95, which serves as the main artery connecting New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Every truck that needed to reach northeastern markets passed through this region, and every distribution center that wanted to serve 100 million people within a single day's drive chose locations in eastern Pennsylvania because the geographic advantages were simply too significant to ignore. Healthcare systems expanded steadily to serve an aging population and to employ the thousands of medical professionals who received training at major universities, creating an employment base that was immune to the kind of global competition that had destroyed steel manufacturing. The Lehigh Valley, which had been a declining industrial zone when its cement and textile plants closed, reinvented itself as one of the largest distribution hubs in the entire country by capitalizing on its location between major cities and its access to highway corridors. Amazon, FedEx, UPS, and dozens of other logistics companies constructed massive warehouse facilities, creating tens of thousands of jobs. Professional services grew around Philadelphia's universities and financial institutions, with law firms, consulting companies, accounting firms, and technology startups all finding ways to thrive in an economy that rewarded education and specialized knowledge rather than physical labor. Each economic sector fed growth in other sectors through mutual dependencies, with healthcare workers needing housing and retail services, logistics workers needing healthcare and financial services, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of diversified growth that looked nothing like the dramatic industrial concentration that had defined Western Pennsylvania. None of these industries in eastern Pennsylvania were as dramatic or as symbolically powerful as steel production had been, because there were no furnaces glowing so bright they lit up the night sky. No 15,000-person workforces concentrated in single facilities. No sense that the work being done was literally building American civilization. But that was precisely the point, because these industries did not need to be dramatic. They just needed to be diverse enough and resilient enough that when one sector struggled, other sectors could absorb the shock and maintain overall employment. When a warehouse closed in eastern Pennsylvania, healthcare was hiring and professional services were expanding. And when manufacturing employment declined, logistics operations were adding shifts and building new facilities. Eastern Pennsylvania had not deliberately planned this economic diversity, but the accidents of history and geography had created an economic structure that could survive precisely the kind of single industry collapse that had devastated Western Pennsylvania. And that structural difference explains why the two halves of the state followed such different demographic trajectories after 1980. The consequences of the steel collapse continue cascading through Western Pennsylvania today, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow demographic bleed that never completely stops. A gradual erosion that becomes visible only when you compare population figures across decades. Between 2020 and 2023, Forest County in western Pennsylvania lost 7% of its total population, while Pike County in the eastern part of the state gained 5% during that same period. Rural Pennsylvania counties in the western part are projected to decline another 6% by 2050, which means that the population drain that began with the closure of steel mills has never actually stopped. It has merely slowed to a pace that makes it less immediately visible. One family leaves, then another family leaves 6 months later. Then the local school district consolidates with the neighboring town because there are not enough students. Then the only grocery store closes because there are not enough customers, and each of these individual losses makes the community less attractive to families who remain. A Mercer County official summarized the situation when he stated that population is the answer to about 95% of the problems facing rural communities in western Pennsylvania, because every other challenge traces back to too few people living in too large an area. Fewer people means less school funding, crumbling infrastructure, because there are not enough taxpayers to maintain roads and bridges, and diminished political representation because legislative districts are redrawn after each census to reflect population changes. When you lose people, you lose the tax base needed to maintain public services, and when you cannot maintain roads or keep libraries open, more people decide to leave, and it becomes a downward spiral that feeds on itself with no obvious mechanism to reverse the process. In some counties, over 1/3 of the working-age population now has a documented disability, and that staggering percentage is not merely a marker of dangerous industrial jobs from decades past, but also a marker of generational economic collapse that created communities where the young and healthy left for opportunities elsewhere, while only those who could not leave remained behind. The mills closed over 40 years ago, but Western Pennsylvania is still paying the price, and the wound that opened in 1977 has never properly healed. One major part of this story remains unfinished, seen by some as real renewal and by others as another false promise. Carnegie Mellon University has become a global leader in robotics and artificial intelligence, producing technologies and startup companies that are reshaping parts of Pittsburgh. At the same time, UPMC has grown into one of Pennsylvania's largest employers, providing stable healthcare jobs that cannot be outsourced or replaced by automation. A new generation is now moving into the city, drawn by affordable housing, improved urban amenities, and jobs in technology and healthcare. They are renovating old row houses, opening coffee shops and breweries, and breathing life into neighborhoods their grandparents once knew. Some census areas are finally gaining population, suggesting Pittsburgh's long decline may be slowing. Beneath the region lies the Marcellus Shale, where natural gas drilling has brought new income to landowners, adding yet another uncertain but powerful force shaping Western Pennsylvania's future. The natural gas boom has brought much-needed money to rural communities that struggled for decades after industrial decline. For landowners with mineral rights, royalty payments have provided financial security that once seemed impossible. However, a central question remains. Can natural gas truly replace the kind of mass employment that coal mines and steel mills once provided? Modern drilling is highly mechanized. A single well may employ dozens of workers during construction, but only a small number once operations begin. This allows the industry to generate large profits without creating widespread employment. As a result, most financial benefits flow to landowners and corporations rather than to large workforces earning steady wages. This makes today's economic gains far more uneven than during the steel era, when thousands of working-class families achieved middle-class stability through industrial jobs. Western Pennsylvania has experienced false hope before. Industries like lumber, coal, and steel once promised lasting prosperity, only to collapse and leave communities behind. Pittsburgh has been promised renewal many times over the past 40 years, often with modest success, but no lasting demographic reversal. The real issue is not whether investment exists, but whether the region is building a diversified and resilient economy, or once again placing its future in the hands of industries that may someday decline. Pennsylvania's demographic divide is not truly about mountains or physical geography. The Appalachian barriers that once slowed Western development were overcome long ago through tunnels, railways, and bridges, becoming irrelevant by 1900. Geography gave Eastern Pennsylvania an early advantage, but it did not determine long-term population outcomes. The real factor was economic structure. Eastern Pennsylvania developed a diversified economy shaped by trade routes, Atlantic ports, and extensive rail connections. This variety of industries allowed the region to adapt when individual sectors declined, sustaining growth over time. Western Pennsylvania, by contrast, tied its future to fewer dominant industries, making it more vulnerable to collapse. Western Pennsylvania built its economy almost entirely around steel because global demand and local resources made it profitable. Eastern Pennsylvania, meanwhile, developed a more diversified and resilient economy. When foreign competition, new technology, and changing demand destroyed the foundations of the steel industry, the two regions responded very differently. The East absorbed the shock through diversification, while the West suffered severe collapse. That divide is still visible today. From space, Eastern Pennsylvania glows with dense population centers around Philadelphia and its connected corridors, while Western Pennsylvania appears far darker, with only Pittsburgh shining as a lone ember of its former industrial power. This division exists not because of the land itself, because the physical landscape was conquered long ago, but because of the economic choices that were made on that land and the demographic consequences that followed from those choices. Geography drew an initial line through Pennsylvania by creating the Appalachian Barrier and giving eastern settlements a developmental advantage. History widened that line through the accumulated advantages of early development, and economics turned that line into a wall by creating fundamentally different economic structures that responded differently to the same global forces. And today, that wall remains standing, as visible from space as it was the day the first steel mill closed its furnaces.